This episode is brought to you by family history website findmypast.co.uk, where you can delve deeper into your family history to really understand the people, places, and events that came before you.
Do you want to know what day-to-day life was like during the Industrial Revolution, or what it was like to grow up in your local area generations ago? You can answer these questions and more by starting your family tree with Find My Past's records, maps, and timelines.
And listeners to Journey Through Time can take advantage of a very special offer. Visit findmypast.co.uk/journeythrough-time to take a free trial and claim 30% off their most popular subscriptions. That's findmypast.co.uk/journeythrough-time. Free trial auto-renews after 7 days unless canceled. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm David Olusoga.
And I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And last time, Sarah, we were telling the story of Victoria Woodhull. We took her from her poverty-stricken childhood in Ohio through a remarkable first half of her life in which she was a child medium traveling around during a spiritualist revival, then breaking through on Wall Street to become the first woman to open a brokerage firm and advising the millionaire Cornelius Vanderbilt, the Jeff Bezos of his day. But it turns out that Wall Street was just a stepping stone. It wasn't the limit of her ambitions. This radical free thinker had much more in mind. In 1870, where she'd made the astonishing decision to run for president, the first woman to do so, even though she didn't have a party behind her and she wasn't even old enough under the Constitution to become president.
That's exactly right. And women didn't even have the vote, but she was determined to change all of that. In order to advance her ambitions, as you said, she didn't have even a political party behind her. Victoria Woodhull made another extraordinary decision. She decided that what she needed was a newspaper.
If you haven't got a party, at least you've got a newspaper.
She needed a microphone. She needed a way to get her ideas out there, and she needed to build an audience. So how is she going to persuade people? Very much like a politician today, I don't know, starting their own social media channel, if we could think of any politicians who had ever done such a thing. Victoria and her sister launched Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly. This was a newspaper. It's a kind of newspaper magazine, really unlike anything else in America at the time. It was, as was always the case with Victoria, it was one of the first papers published by women.
So another arena in which she's a groundbreaker.
She's constantly trailblazing. And now she was not the first, but one of the very first. And as we're saying, it gave her a direct line to readers all over the country.
But this is not just a campaigning tool. I mean, this really is a sort of newspaper that's going to deal with all sorts of issues.
It covered a huge spectrum, actually. It was definitely part political journal, part manifesto, covering women's rights, labor reform, of course, spiritualism, her belief in sexual autonomy, in political autonomy. But it was also part scandal sheet. There was lots of gossip in it. And in particular, she became interested very quickly in exposing corruption. Business and political corruption. So she is a disruptor. She is there to disrupt the status quo. And she opens this magazine and gets busy.
How does her feminism, her gender politics, how is that manifest in this new magazine?
Victoria's sexual and gender agenda is very central to what the Weekly was about. But it was also, there was a lot of spiritualism, and it was politics more widely. Last time we were very focused on her interest in the sexual revolution. But as we're going to see in this story, labor reform and workers' rights rapidly became very important for Victoria as well. And the Weekly began really championing that side of the radical agenda as well. Victoria really believed that working men and women should be natural allies because they were both exploited by capital. They were both silenced by law. They were both held hostage to various systems that denied them control, right? Over their own labor, over their bodies, over their wages. So she absolutely saw that, of course, working men and women should be coming together. Didn't actually work out that way in practice. But as part of that vision, she became the first publisher to translate Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto into English and publish it in the United States.
This is a woman who also is running a stock brokerage on Wall Street, publishing Karl Marx.
and running for president. And so it makes clear how avant-garde she is. But we said last time how full of contradictions she is. And this is one of the clearest ones, right? She's literally making a fortune on Wall Street while calling for the overthrow of capitalism. And it's not clear that she even saw it as a contradiction, because she was very clear why she wanted to make money. It's, at least at this point in her life, it's not clear that wealth was the goal in and of itself. She wanted what money could do. She wanted to use the money to, subvert from within, to make money from capital to destroy capital. At least that's how she saw it at that point. So even as she's finding great success within these systems, she's calling for them to be torn down. And she actually joined Section 12 of the International Working Men's Association in America,
This is First International.
Marx's famous First International. But a little bit later, Marx and his allies actually expelled her section. They didn't let her stay in it because they said that her focus on women's rights and free love was a diversion from class struggle. So they did not accept that they were natural allies, where she saw them as very much part of the same struggle. They said women's reform is not part of our class struggle and kicked her out.
Publishing a newspaper that is publishing communist tracts is not going to win her many friends.
And she wasn't just annoying people by publishing the Communist Manifesto. She also began publishing exposés of fraudulent businessmen, of corruption, both economic and financial corruption, and also political corruption.
And there's no shortage of corruption of all of those types in America's infamous Gilded Age.
No, exactly. This is a time when, in fact, financial and political corruption are deeply intertwined.
And they go right to the top. I mean, this is an age full of scandals.
The president at the time was Ulysses S. Grant, and his administration is famously corrupt. Right now, people are talking a lot about corruption in American political life, but, today doesn't have a monopoly on it in American history by any stretch of the imagination. And this is a time exactly where it's a time of backroom deals. It's a time of open corruption. Everybody knew that there were all kinds of improprieties and outright criminal wrongdoing that was happening at the top. And Victoria and her newspaper started exposing it. They also started exposing personal revelations. They started hinting broadly at sexual improprieties, and indeed at the idea that some of the most respectable men in America might be leading double lives. Should also sound like a familiar idea today. Now, there are reports that Victoria traded threats of sexual exposure for these powerful men to make financial contributions to the women's movement, to the suffrage movement.
I'll expose you if you don't give me some money.
Give me some money, but it wasn't for personal wealth, although it might have financially benefited her personally, but it was political blackmail. She was saying, pay up or I'll blow the whistle. But I don't think there's any doubt that her commitment to this radical sexual freedom that she wanted to see for women, that commitment was real. I don't think that she was in this for personal enrichment. However, that may have, also come about. But of course, I could be wrong. But what's clear is that when she gained power, however, whether it was money or political power or whatever kind of power she ever gained, she threw the weight of that power behind women's reform.
And how does the rest of the suffrage movement, the women's rights movement, how did they react to Victoria? Because the way you win influence, the way you persuade people politically in the America of the 1870s, you've got to stay on the right side of respectability. And she is very much not on the right side.
She's very much on the wrong side of respectability, and she has no patience with respectability. She's not interested in respectability, but she also sees very clearly that respectability is a veil for hypocrisy, and hypocrisy really starts to infuriate her. And the problem is, as you imply there, and you're absolutely right with your question, is that the feminist activists like Susan B. Anthony, who we met last time, for our British listeners, we said she's America's Mrs. Pankhurst, they're already wary of the fact that she's pushing beyond just asking for the vote. She's making all of these demands. She has this flamboyant lifestyle.
And she's not like them. She's not like middle class. She's not respectable. She's not from good families.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So she's an outsider in every way. And then she's coming in and kind of calling for the overthrow of the order that they're carefully, painstakingly trying to incrementally make some progress in. And she comes in and says, let's burn the whole thing down. right? Just enough. So of course they're not going to be comfortable with that. They're going to be deeply threatened by that. But they also were afraid that she would drag them down into these scandals, that she was so scandalous that she would taint their movement by association.
She would discredit them all.
Exactly.
To some terrible scandal that would come out.
Because she kept engaging in scandalous behavior. And at this point, she herself is already seen as a disreputable character. You know, she was a spiritualist. She is divorced. She's remarried. She is, you know, yes, it's one thing to say that you're making money on Wall Street and that they were, you know, gawking at her. But there's also a very uncomfortable implication through a lot of that, that means that these are loose women. The rumors around their relationship with Vanderbilt, all of this stuff suggests that she is very far from a respectable woman of the type that Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton want to be supporting. All of that said, they did support her for a while. They did have a tenuous alliance, but they were worried. From the beginning, they were eyeing her askance, but seeing if she could help them. As you might imagine, it didn't take long for a magazine that was churning out messages like that on a weekly basis to become a sensation, immensely popular, scandalous, and deeply threatening to the establishment.
I mean, it's selling at 20,000 copies at its peak.
And Victoria was just getting started. Her next step was political. In January 1871, Victoria Woodhull became another first. She broke yet more new ground by becoming the first woman to testify before a congressional committee, the first to testify before Congress. And what she did was she went to the House Judiciary Committee and argued that the recently ratified 14th and 15th Amendments granted women the right to vote.
Had unintentionally already done so.
And it's an audacious argument. It's actually really appealing in a lot of ways because the 14th and 15th Amendments are very much understood then as now to very much not give women the vote. Both the 14th and the 15th Amendments, as we said last time, were passed after the Civil War. Now, the 14th Amendment granted citizenship to anyone born in the U.S. That's crucial to it. It's called birthright citizenship. And it promised equal protection under the law to all citizens. Okay, so these are the predicates of her argument. So we need to understand these key points. So 14th Amendment says everyone born in the U.S. is a citizen. And it says everyone who's a citizen has equal protection under the law. Now, that was meant to guarantee rights for formerly enslaved people. But what it did was it also introduced the word male into the Constitution for the first time. So it's making a distinction between citizenship rights and voting rights, and that they're not the same for men and women. The 15th Amendment declared that the right to vote could not be denied based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, which is what gives Black men the vote, but it makes no mention of women at all. So what Woodhull argued was that if women were citizens under the 14th Amendment, and had equal protection under the law, under the 14th Amendment, and voting was a right of citizenship under the 15th Amendment, then women already had the right to vote. The government just wasn't enforcing it. It's a really pretty argument.
It is a really clever argument. It's not what they want to hear, though.
It's not going to work, but it's a nice argument. She actually, one of my favorite details in the story is that when she was presenting her case to Congress, she insisted that they address her as Citizen Woodhull.
Like in the French Revolution.
Like the French Revolution, exactly. Declaring herself obviously a full political equal and emphasizing those citizenship rights, but exactly shades of the French Revolution. And avoiding the gendered title of Mrs. Woodhull, right? So making them call her Citizen Woodhull. And this bold legal argument that she made became known as the New Departure. And it said, the Constitution grants citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. With citizenship comes the right to vote. Therefore, women are already enfranchised.
So they just need to go out and vote.
And that's exactly what she urged all women to do. And it's exactly what she and her sister would go do, is they would go try to cast their votes because in their view, they already had the right to do so. Now, it's probable that she got this argument, because this is a sophisticated legal constitutional argument for a woman who doesn't have a fourth grade education, right? She had certainly educated herself to a great extent, but this is still a sophisticated argument.
She's still trying to make up for the fact that she had, 3 years of schooling?
3 years of schooling. So she's very much an autodidact, but it's unlikely that she made this very clever legal argument completely on her own. She was probably coached by a radical Massachusetts senator with whom she had developed a close relationship. relationship. She was developing these relationships with powerful men, and he was one of them. Many people assume there was a sexual aspect to the relationship. We don't know. But she goes before Congress and she makes this calm, authoritative, legally daring argument. And it was revolutionary. Congress ignored her entirely, of course. That was a foregone conclusion.
But it's quite a thing to go to Congress, to be the first woman to do so, and to be interpreting amendments to the US Constitution with a brilliant legal argument behind you.
And to say, you've got it wrong, guys. You've got this wrong. Give me the vote. So they didn't, but you got to love that she tried. Meanwhile, Victoria has this, we have this way when we tell the story of Victoria Woodhull to keep having to go, meanwhile, she's doing something else.
Because she's never doing just one thing.
I mean, the woman was indefatigable. I do not know how she did all of this, but she was not stopping at suffrage because she had other arguments that she wanted to make. After becoming the first woman to address Congress, about 10 months later, she shocked the nation again. She was not done. She stood up at Steinway Hall in New York and she vocally declared herself a supporter of free love. And she said that women would never be free until they controlled their own bodies, their own marriages, their own sexual choices.
What did she mean by free love? I mean, she didn't mean it, I guess, in the 1960s sense.
That's what people assume, I think, when they see the phrase, right? Is kind of polyamory or promiscuity or, let it all hang out. She was okay with any of those things. She did not have a problem with them, but she meant something much more basic, what we would call sexual autonomy, the right to live love as you choose. And so if that's being sex positive, if that's being polyamorous, she would have no problem with that. But she wasn't calling for that either. She was just calling for sexual autonomy.
I guess that the government and the law out of your love life.
Keep the state away from your body. Your sexual life has nothing to do with the state. And she always said that because she could see the misery that unhappy marriages had brought to so many people, for her, there was no possibility of a safe and secure society until you had addressed this fundamental problem that was causing misery and suffering for, in her view, millions of people.
And she's speaking as a woman who was married off at the age of 15 into an unhappy marriage with a con man who was an alcoholic.
She knew what she was talking about.
It's not just that she's seen this. She's lived it.
She's lived it. And then she sees that it wasn't just her, that she was far from unique, and that it was not just a problem that faced women, that men were being made miserable by being locked in unhappy marriages too. And of course, she could see the problems for children who were being raised by people trapped in unhappy marriages, and obviously the cycles of violence and abuse and addiction and all of the things that would be, correlated with that. But free love to the majority of Americans at the time just meant sexual anarchy. That's what they heard her calling for, was just all bets are off, all rules are broken. You can sleep with whoever you like. You can commit adultery when you're married. I mean, this was not something that Victorian America, any more than Victorian Britain, would have been ready to hear this. And the suffragists were not ready to hear it either. It was way too radical for them as well. So there was a national uproar when she said this. I mean, people went nuts. It was a huge scandal that anybody who had become as prominent as she had would call for anything that was seen as that extreme, that anarchic. So yeah, and at that moment, her brief, tenuous alliance with the women's suffrage movement ended.
So she's a scandalous figure by this point.
And they want nothing to do with her.
Yeah, you can see why. You can see the fear that she's going to discredit their whole movement by this extreme, in their view, extreme demand.
And in their defense, she's also a loose cannon. It's clear by this point that she's not somebody who's going to stay on message. She is not somebody that you can say, we'll go this far and no farther. She's going to go as far as she thinks she needs to.
This is not someone you can build an alliance with and say, step by step, slowly, cautiously.
Yeah, exactly. That is not how she approaches anything. So you can understand if you're trying to develop a political movement that you would just see her as too unreliable, too reckless at a minimum. But the specific call to free love was absolutely, a light to a powder keg. I mean, it just was explosive. She famously said in this speech, so somebody shouted out, "Do you believe in free love?" from the audience. And she said, "Yes, I am a free lover. I have an inalienable, constitutional, and natural right to love whom I may, to love as long or as short a period as I can, to change that love every day if I please."
That's radical for 1971, and this is 1871.
She is here again very much ahead of her time, but America, as you say, was a long way away from being ready to catch up with her.
Yeah, that is not the spirit of 1871 there.
No, it really isn't. It's not really the spirit of a lot of America right now.
Yeah, I mean, read the room. I mean, that's not where 1870s America was.
Exactly. But it's where Victoria Woodhull was. And the thing is, of course, is that this is where she's so far ahead of her time, because there are so many people today that would agree with her, not only that those rights are important, but that the lack of those rights is at the heart of a great deal of human and social suffering.
Yeah, I mean, listening to her story, reading about her, this is not just about the past. I mean, these struggles about bodily autonomy, sexual autonomy, they're not over.
Very far from being over, right? There are many reasons why her story resonates so much today. As you say, it's not over. A woman hasn't become a president yet either. There are lots of ways in which her story still resonates. So, by early 1872, she's basically at the height of her fame. This free love speech has made her a national byword. You know, it's shocked everybody, but everybody has heard of her.
She still has a brokerage firm on Wall Street, the first woman to do so. She still runs a newspaper, and she has declared her intention to run for president of the United States.
And by this point, because of the notoriety, the celebrity that she has achieved, and with the help of her newspaper, she has enough recognition, enough visibility that she can begin to build a real political platform, and indeed she doesn't lead a political party, but to take part in a political party. And she joins forces with the Equal Rights Party. And it is under the Equal Rights Party that she declares her candidacy for president in 1872, 2 years after having announced her ambition for it. But now we're in an election year. And with the Equal Rights Party, she says, this is it. I'm throwing my hat in the ring. At the meeting where her nomination for the Equal Rights Party was agreed, as we heard in a passage that you read last time, David, the party also nominated Frederick Douglass as her running mate.
Now, Frederick Douglass is one of the most famous men in the world in the 1870s. This is a man who had escaped from slavery, a man whose freedom had been purchased while he was in Britain. He'd toured Britain. He'd published one of the most famous autobiographies of the 19th century. I mean, people, when trying to describe Douglass, often say he's the 19th century's equivalent of Martin Luther King. This is the great anti-slavery African-American rights campaigner.
And as you say, he's one of the most famous Black Americans in the world at the time.
And he's also a long-term supporter of women's rights and for women to get the vote. So it's not a crazy idea. He's someone who believes and has campaigned for lots of the things the Equal Right Party is going to campaign for.
That's true. But at the time, he's also a public supporter of the incumbent president, Ulysses S. Grant.
We should also say that President Ulysses S. Grant had been the great general in the Union Army during the Civil War. This is the man who had defeated the Confederacy, the man who had taken the surrender famously from General Lee. So he is a war hero, the war that ended slavery, and he's now president. So it's quite natural that the great African-American abolitionist would support Ulysses Grant.
It's important for us to recognize that although Douglass was nominated by the Equal Rights Party, he was not her running mate in a way that we would recognize in today's politics.
Did he agree to be nominated?
He did not agree to be nominated. In fact,
so it was news to him.
It was news to him, and it was unwelcome news to him because he was publicly pledging his support for Grant. And he said, I'm not going to have anything to do with this. This is not...
awkward.
Yeah, this is not my circus. You know, you guys do your thing. I'm going to do mine. So he just distanced himself without actually repudiating them, but he absolutely distanced himself and said, this is not something I'm party to. It was obviously, as you suggest, David, it was a symbolic choice, right? They were making a statement about universal rights. They were tying women's suffrage to Black civil rights. And we were talking earlier about the ways in which the women's rights movement had split a schism over the question of Black civil rights. And so the Equal Rights Party was making this symbolic choice to bring them back together again. But it's also a really provocative thing for them to do at the time, because the early 1870s are a moment when interracial relationships are a major flashpoint in American politics.
And this is the fear about Black men and white women in the South in particular.
Exactly. What was called miscegenation, right?
Racial mixing.
Racial mixing. And this threat of interracial relationships was used to justify racial violence.
Because if you want a segregated society, if you want Jim Crow laws, as they're going to be called, if you want black people and white people to live in separate spheres, mixed race children don't help.
Well, they blow the whole thing up, right? So if you have a society that's based on a rigid racial binary and a claim that one group in that racial binary is inherently inferior to the other, and then, as you say, a whole system built on that, well, you need to know whether you're black or white. And mixed race blows the whole thing up. It simply doesn't work anymore. Racial mixing blurs the line, literally, right? It blurs the racial line. It undermines segregation. It undermines the legal structure that is keeping black people oppressed and keeping them disenfranchised. So you can't have it.
What's the reaction to such a provocative move in the 1870s?
It was exactly as you would expect. There was, a huge outcry. But as we heard at the beginning of the episode last time, there was a lot of ridicule as well. They thought it was just ludicrous. They thought this was absolute nonsense. Who is going to vote for a woman? Who is going to vote for a black man? Who is going to vote for an Indigenous American who was also mooted at this meeting? So a lot of mainstream America just reacts by saying, this is ludicrous. Don't be ridiculous. But it is also deeply threatening. She was being ridiculed, but whatever anybody else thought, Victoria was serious. What she was demanding was universal suffrage.
So this is provocation, but this is a genuine belief on her part.
It is, although it is also worth noting the degree to which they were appropriating Frederick Douglass's own hard-won political agency. I mean, their motives may have been good, but they were still using his name, his credibility to further their own political agenda without even checking with him. So we need to, acknowledge that. But yeah, her commitment is real. This is about labor rights. This is about the belief in working men and women needing to be allies. And, she was ahead of her time in seeing that importance of strategic political alliances. She saw suffrage as a workers' issue. She wanted labor unions to understand that women's rights were part of their struggle. All of that said, we've been calling it a campaign, but it's really more rhetoric.
I mean, does it have what you'd expect from a campaign? Are there people knocking on doors? Is there a tour around the country?
No whistle-stop tours, no rallies, no campaign trail. There's no real party machinery. There's just a nomination, and then there's just an outpouring of speeches and articles and essays making the case.
So she can make a noise, but she's not in a position with this tiny party, this lack of infrastructure to build a proper campaign.
No, and let's remember that she wasn't eligible for the presidency anyway by virtue of age, let alone the question of whether women could run in the first place. What she had was a message, and she used it to make headlines. That's what she's trying to do. She wants to position these ideas. She wants to further these ideas where it's less about her being a candidate than it is about being a revolutionary.
But she gets her name on the ballot.
She got on the ballot in 22 states. At a time when there were only 37 states in the Union. So it's pretty good going. A really remarkable feat given that women couldn't even vote.
For a radical candidate of the wrong gender in the minds of almost everyone who can vote, with a party that doesn't really exist as a political movement, with an African-American running mate who's
who doesn't want to be there.
who's a scandalous figure who couldn't be president anyway because she's too young. Yeah, I mean, it is pretty well. Everything about it is remarkable.
It's pretty good going. Unfortunately, all of this rhetoric, which is, persuading enough people that she gets on the ballot in 22 states, is also starting to alienate the wealthy and the powerful, including even her old ally, Cornelius Vanderbilt, who quietly starts to distance himself. And at the same time, the sisters' brokerage, which is being run by her husband as she's off doing her political, campaigning and running the weekly, the brokerage is starting to make increasingly risky speculations. And all of this is happening while her personal life is coming under increasing scrutiny, right? She has what is effectively an open relationship with her husband. She is advocating for free love. She has this wildly eccentric family. They've got all kinds of shenanigans going on. They're constantly getting into the press. So she's a really easy target for scandal.
All of this in the public eye as she becomes a bigger, more sensational figure, a more controversial figure.
Yeah, this to me is one of those classic times where the image of, the plate spinning faster and faster, and it's all about to come crashing down.
As we will discover after the break.
Join us then.
Welcome back. Now, Victoria Woodhull got herself on the ballot in 22 states, but I've never heard of President Woodhull, so I'm guessing she didn't win.
Plot spoil, David. I mean, okay, I guess everybody can work out that she does not, in fact, win the election. No, she does not. And there were other reasons for it all going wrong besides her being a woman and not...
And all the other reasons why she was never going to win
exactly.
in a million years. The winner, for those who want to know, was Ulysses S. Grant, the incumbent, and Horace Greeley, who's almost as obscure as Victoria Woodhull, was the Democratic defeated candidate.
Well, you say that Greeley is very famous in American history because he is the editor who said, "Go west, young man."
Oh, is he?
Yeah.
That's his claim.
He was the editor of the New York Tribune. So
you don't get the presidency, but you get a famous phrase.
He's actually entangled in the story of the Woodhulls, actually, we could have a whole section on Greeley, but we're not going to because, as you say, a lot of people haven't heard of him anymore. So we're only going to uncover one forgotten person per episode, I think, right?
That's our rule.
We got to control ourselves. So we know it's not going to work, but one of the reasons why everything comes crashing down is because Victoria decides to pick a different fight, as if she didn't have enough going on.
And she does it at a vital point in the presidential campaign.
She picks her moment, and you might argue that she picks a bad moment, although, yes, she did it very deliberately.
And she picks a bad moment, but she picks a very, very big target.
Yeah. She picks the wrong opponent, it turns out. Now, to explain all of this, we have to back up a little bit and fill everybody in on a little bit of a backstory here, because we were talking about the ways in which the prominent figures in the suffrage movement, the respectable figures in the suffrage movement, were threatened by Victoria's radicalism. Some of the best known of those suffragists were actually members of the prominent Beecher family. The Beecher who is the best remembered today is Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, the most popular novel of 19th century America.
The most popular novel in 19th century Britain. The only book that sold more copies in Britain, in Victorian Britain, than Uncle Tom's Cabin was the Bible.
Same thing was true in the US as well.
She's a global figure. I mean, she outsells Dickens in England in the 19th century. It's incredible.
It wasn't just a bestseller, right? It was a cultural phenomenon.
It was a phenomenon, absolutely.
Phenomenon is the word for it.
I mean, the fact that we still know the characters from Uncle Tom's Cabin, the Topsy and Uncle Tom himself, it was enormous, and she was incredibly famous because part of its story was it was written by this woman.
Yeah. And this is totally apocryphal, but there's a famous story.
I know what you're going to say.
That Lincoln supposedly greeted Stowe by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war."
It's one of those apocryphal stories that should be true.
I know.
Because it speaks to a truth.
And that's it. So although it's been disproved by historians, it's been debunked, he didn't say it, it expresses a truth, which is that Uncle Tom's Cabin was a proximate cause of precipitating America into the Civil War because it convinced so many readers that slavery was wrong, who otherwise had thought that it was, they believed Southern propaganda and thought it was okay, not okay, but that they could live with it. And then Uncle Tom's Cabin was this great moral expose and said, this is outrageous and you cannot, be complicit with this.
And it convinced people in Britain not to support a government that might have gone along with the Confederacy. I mean, it has a global impact.
It's a really, really important book. Stowe's brother was just as famous as she was at the time, however. Henry Ward Beecher was a very famous preacher, and a couple of their sisters, they were a big family, a couple of their sisters were also prominent suffragists. And the Beecher family had built their reputation on social reform, like Stowe, but also on Christian morality. So you'd see that this uber respectable family who are, pillars of the community, they definitely see Woodhull as a threat. They see her as deeply dangerous.
And they're as famous as she is. Henry Ward Beecher, the most recent biography of him is titled The Most Famous Man in America. So she's now tangling with people who have astonishing fame. And the fact that it's a family, that its sisters and brothers are all famous, I kind of think like they're the sort of the moral Christian Kardashians, basically.
I love that. There's an image. It is a lot like that, exactly. And then who the people that they marry become famous by association and stuff like that. So they're starting to get very threatened by what she's up to, so much so that Harriet Beecher Stowe published a thinly veiled character assassination of Victoria Woodhull. But the reason that Harriet Beecher Stowe was on the warpath against Victoria was not because she threatened the respectability of the suffrage movement. It was because she threatened the respectability of the Beechers. Because Victoria had found out what was an open secret in some circles, but a very protected secret outside of those circles, which was that Henry Ward Beecher, this national icon of Christian morality, who was known for his progressive sermons on abolition, on temperance, indeed on women's rights. But we have to remember that being progressive in Victorian America in the 1870s is still a time Christian morality, in the ways that we've been talking about, is still dominating public life. So we have to think about his progressivism in very relative terms. So by today's standards, he's still a deeply conservative man, and especially in his public support for traditional marriage. But in private, Henry Ward Beecher lived by very different rules. It was said at the time that every Sunday when he was preaching in church, he was preaching to 20 of his mistresses. So he was a married man preaching against adultery to the married women he was sleeping with.
Within that circle, he was having affairs with women who were within that tight kind of moral Christian circle.
Yeah, and lots of them, right? I mean, he was really sleeping around. He was seducing women with his personality. He had this tremendous charisma. Everybody talked about how charismatic he was.
He's one of the great orators of the 19th century, and that's saying something because he's in an age with people like Frederick Douglass. I mean, people used to travel to New York to hear him speak in his church in Brooklyn. When boats left Manhattan, they were called Beecher boats because they were full of people who wanted to hear these very, very long speeches. And he was incredibly theatrical. I mean, he is an enormous figure. He's not as famous as his sister, who wrote the most famous novel of the 19th century, but he probably was as famous as her at the time.
At the time he was, yeah. And he's a huge celebrity and a hugely admired figure.
He's also a huge guy. I mean, just physically, yeah.
He's like 200 pounds. He's a big guy. He's not that handsome. He's clearly seducing women with his personality, not with his looks.
He's very striking looking, though.
Yeah.
I agree he's not obviously a handsome guy, but he really is striking looking.
Yeah, he has these tremendously light eyes. Like, you can, even in, we were talking about Victorian photographs and how, they don't always capture people, but he has this light beams out of his eyes. And it's not hard to imagine that in person he would have been deeply, deeply attractive. And he certainly enjoyed it. As I say, within small circles, he was well known for the fact that he's sleeping around, but to wider mainstream America, this is absolutely unknown and would have come as an enormous and unwelcome shock.
And now Victoria Woodhull.
She finds out about it.
Yeah,
so
she's in trouble.
She finds out about it because, we need to remember, this is crucial here, because she's being lambasted for calling for free love, by which she means Henry Ward Beecher's right, for example, to have an open marriage if he wants one. So her position is that what Henry Ward Beecher is doing is fine, but she's being lambasted for saying that, and he's doing it, right? And this is the crucial context. So what happens is she finds out from a former ally of Beecher's, a reformer named Theodore Tilton, who discovers that Beecher is having a years-long affair with Tilton's own wife. So this is one part of this open secret, or it's known to this, circle of Northeastern reformers, but they're all covering it up. And Tilton basically gets, increasingly bitter and betrayed. He gets closer to Victoria during this same period, in this 1871, 1872 period. They probably became lovers, Tilton and Victoria. And he tells her that his wife is sleeping with Henry Ward Beecher. And she also hears it from the suffragists who also know it. So she hears it from multiple people. She knows it to be true, believes it to be true. And this just intensifies her anger at the hypocrisy, because here is yet another example of a man getting away with what she is being publicly vilified for just calling for. She's just saying this is what people should be allowed to do, and she's being totally vilified for it. So she tells Beecher to step up. She says, you need to come out in public and admit that you believe what I believe, that you believe in free love, and you need to defend it, and you need to defend me, and you need to say that there's nothing unacceptable about what I'm saying. You need to stand up for your principles, because these are your principles. This is how you live your life. And she's being publicly denounced for it. Guess what he did?
I'm going to guess he came out fully in her support and admitted his hypocrisy and supported her as run for president.
Of course he did, yes. He stood up and he said, yeah, I'm a bad guy, I'm a hypocrite. Obviously not what Beecher did, right? So he decides that his reputation is far more important than the truth.
And he throws her under the bus.
Totally throws her under the bus. And so she is incandescent, and she decides that she's going to force the issue. Because what does she have? She has a newspaper. So she publishes a full expose of Beecher's affair in her magazine on November 2nd, 1872, 2 days before the presidential election. Now, this is a bold move by any reckoning.
This is exploding a bomb
Exactly.
in 48 hours before the poll.
She pulled the hand grenade open and tossed it into... No, but as we were saying earlier, she didn't really have a viable presidential campaign anyway. She's just surrounded by all this sanctimony and all of this hypocrisy. And she's trying to get a message across, and she just wanted to blow it all up and expose the moral hypocrisy. And she did it. It certainly blew up. The scandal exploded. But Beecher's defenders rallied around him, very much including his sister, Harriet Beecher Stowe.
One of the most famous women in the world, a woman who was given an audience with Queen Victoria when she came to Britain, a superstar.
Yeah. And she and all of his circle of allies. It's also important to remember, you said all, the flocks of people that were coming to see him. His church was making people a lot of money. So the people who ran the church had no interest in Beecher being exposed as a hypocrite. So they rallied around him as well. They all circle the wagons and they denounce Victoria. They call her a liar. They call her a blackmailer. They call her a degenerate. And in fact, Victoria and her sister and her husband were almost immediately arrested. Arrested. Now, you might think they were arrested for libel.
Yeah, that's what I presumed.
Yeah, but it's not. They were charged with obscenity for mailing their magazine, which told this story, through the Postal Service. Now, in fact, they were never convicted of this, so it didn't really count as obscenity, but they were charged with it. The next day, on November 3rd, U.S. Marshals stormed their house and dragged them off to jail.
The next day is the day before the election. Victoria is a candidate.
Yeah, she spent election night behind bars. So the first woman to run for president was sitting in a cell, accused, by the way, not of lying, but of telling the truth.
There's a metaphor in there somewhere.
Right? Their arrest was a warning, clearly, right? The nation society, the establishment will tolerate women pushing boundaries, but only up to a point. Her case set the stage, in fact, for a really consequential law called the Comstock Act of 1873, which expanded censorship laws and gave moral crusaders. There was a guy named Anthony Comstock. He got sweeping power to police speech about sex and contraception and morality.
What happens to Victoria?
Victoria spends a month in jail, and then she was released, but she was not done fighting because she knew that all she had done was tell the truth. Because this is all part of the same problem that she's trying to expose. She keeps getting vilified, and their hypocrisy keeps getting protected.
But she started a scandal.
Yeah, she started a scandal. The momentum picks up, and then it continues without any input from her to roll and roll. Because what happens next is that Tilton, the guy whose wife was sleeping with Beecher and who was sleeping with Victoria and told her the story, he ends up suing Beecher for alienation of affections.
Alienation of affections.
Which means you slept with my wife.
You could sue someone.
Yeah.
And he's not getting sued. He's not suing Beecher for sleeping with his wife. It's about his wife being alienated from him.
Yeah, that's the technicality. He is suing him for sleeping with his wife.
Yeah, but
that's what
the law
doing.
says you can sue someone because the affair makes your wife not like you anymore?
Yeah, it's closer to the idea of what would become known as a correspondent, the idea that somebody else is getting in the middle of this relationship, and then you can sue on the basis of this contravention of the marriage contract.
Alienation of affections.
It's the idea that a civil contract has been disrupted by an outside force, if you like, is kind of one way of thinking about it.
Most of the affections I've alienated in my life, I managed by myself without a third party.
was not required. But of course, what this does is it confirms the story. It shows that here's the actual guy involved in the story, and he sues Beecher and says, yeah, you did sleep with my wife.
Yeah, so it vindicates.
It should vindicate Victoria, but that's not how it played out.
She's been in prison for a month, and it's all coming out in court.
What became called the Beecher-Tilton trial or the Beecher-Tilton scandal was the kind of scandal of the century as far as 19th century America was concerned. It lasted for 6 months. It filled the newspapers daily, but it ended in a hung jury, which meant that Beecher was effectively acquitted, and he returned triumphantly to the pulpit.
To alienate the affection of more women.
I mean, he kept alienating affections all over the place.
He was good at it.
Beecher liked alienating affections. It's got to be said. And it gets worse because Elizabeth Tilton, the wife, very soon after the trial ended, she admitted in writing that she slept with Henry Ward Beecher. So Victoria's vindicated on all counts, but Beecher's reputation was basically restored and Victoria's reputation was destroyed.
So she was right, but she chose the wrong target. She chose someone more powerful than herself.
That's exactly it.
From a more powerful family.
That was it.
With more supporters, who was making more money for more people.
There were so many people who had a vested interest in keeping Beecher, in the position that he was in. That's what the establishment looked like, and it closed ranks. She was left with her reputation in tatters, and everything started to fall apart. So it's not just polite society that won't have anything to do with her. Radical reformers won't have anything to do with her either. At the same time, there's a stock market crash in 1873.
This is the Great Panic of 73.
Yeah, which is one of the most important financial panics of the 19th century in America. And that wipes out what was left of her brokerage. So this immense fortune that she'd had.
Well, people at the time called the Depression afterwards the Great Depression.
The Great Depression.
Right up until 1929, this is the Great Depression.
This was the Great Depression. And it was caused by the speculation that we were talking about
so not
earlier.
Not a good time to be a stockbroker.
And she loses everything. So her fortune, which had once been in the equivalent of millions today, is just wiped out. She gets embroiled in all of these fights trying to, clear her reputation, to vindicate herself. And then her health breaks down under the strain. So by 1876, so basically the next 4 years, it all falls apart. Her weekly magazine has also ceased publication. That year, after years of strain, Woodhull filed for divorce from James Blood. Now, of course, there's no such thing as no-fault divorce in the 1870s. There had to be a reason.
A guilty party.
There had to be a guilty party and a reason offered. And her reason was, we might think ironic, it was infidelity. More alienation of affections.
Yeah. Difficult case to make when you've been advocating free love for a decade.
Right? But divorce laws didn't recognize mutual separation, right? So I see her as, for our listeners who know Casablanca, this is Claude Rains being shocked that there's gambling going on. She goes, Colonel Blood, you've been having affairs. We must have a divorce. Obviously, their marriage had just broken down, and that was This was
the convenience. It's a fiction.
It's a polite fiction. It's a legal fiction. And by 1877, the divorce is finalized. That year, Cornelius Vanderbilt kind of re-enters the story in one way of thinking by dying. This is one way of re-entering a story, I guess. So he's been kind of not part of the picture now for some years.
But he has history with Victoria and her sister.
And his son, who has just inherited his vast estate, is worried that Victoria and her sister might get involved in legal disputes with his siblings over the estate. So he makes a very simple decision and pays them to leave the country, get out of town. And they're broke. So they take the money and they sail to England. They go to Britain.
They come to Britain.
They come to Britain in 1877. Victoria goes back on the speaking circuit and she repudiates her past free love advocacy. She basically blames it on bad influences back in America, which is, again, pretty ironic since she was seen as the bad influence by most of her fellow countrymen.
Is this like a reinvention for a new audience?
It's
and
another
a new phase
reinvention.
In her life?
Yeah. She is ready to reinvent herself for the umpteenth time. And she meets a British man named John Biddulph Martin, a wealthy banker. It seems that they genuinely fell in love. They had a long courtship because his mother didn't trust her. I wonder why.
Yeah, she reads the newspapers, I would guess.
Exactly. But eventually they marry, and she spent the rest of her long life living in his large manor home in Worcestershire.
That's quite a jump from New York stock brokerage on Wall Street running for president to a country house in Worcestershire.
I know. I love it. She became the lady of the manor and, she's kind of presiding over village fetes and the whole 9 yards.
So the last time she was like living in the countryside, it was rural Ohio in the
1840s.
1840s.
Yeah, 1850s. Yeah, 1840s, 1850s. Yeah.
Wow.
So
Back
here
to the
we
country.
are. Yeah, 30 years later, and life looks very different.
Yeah, now she's lady of the manor, literally.
Yeah. So it's a proper rags to riches story. And listeners who are finding Victoria appealing will probably be glad to know for her sake that she lives out her days in comfort. But it's not all a happy ending.
There was one final reinvention of Victoria Woodhull, which is a really difficult one to talk about and one that really complicates how I think about her.
I agree. And it's a very shocking coda to her story because we've been following this woman who has this radical progressive agenda. Now, she would not be the first liberal in youth to turn conservative in age. But as always, Victoria is a figure of extremes. And her rightward turn is an extreme one. She actually turns to the pseudoscience of eugenics. In 1892, she founded a magazine called The Humanitarian. which was dedicated to social progress through what they called science, what we would call pseudoscience, focusing on heredity and selective breeding. Now, this was not a disreputable rag. This attracted major writers, George Bernard Shaw, Florence Nightingale, even her old ally, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, all contributed to this magazine. But Woodhull was arguing in it that humanity should apply animal breeding principles to people, ensuring that only the fit reproduced. So this is social Darwinism at its most extreme. Only the fit are allowed to reproduce.
This is what we call negative eugenics. The positive eugenics is the idea that people who are deemed to be superior, that they should have arranged or selective marriages. That's not what she's arguing. She's arguing that people who are deemed to be unfit should be prevented from marrying, prevented from having children, and even sterilized against their will.
Against their will. And the key here is that phrase deemed to be, because of course it begs the question,
who decides?
Deemed by whom? Yeah. Who gets to decide which people are fit to reproduce and
what
which
are the standards?
People are not? Yeah.
What are the criteria? Who is good? Who is bad? And the eugenics movement, of which she's now part, it decides that, well, we decide. It's people like us, and it's not like them.
Yeah, it's playing God.
Yeah.
Right. And it is on a slippery slope where people start to make exactly those kinds of decisions. She explicitly promoted limits on birth control access, state intervention to stop the propagation of undesirable traits, which again goes to that point, who decides what's desirable and what's undesirable. And even, ironically, again, I mean, there are so many ironies here, marriage restriction. The great advocate of free love who blows up her life over the idea, over the insistence that you should have open marriages, now starts to call for marriage restrictions on the basis of eugenics policy.
To stop people getting married.
To stop the wrong people getting married. Some people can get married, but not the wrong people, unfit people.
I mean, the complication here is that there were many people who regarded eugenics as absolutely part of being progressive. It was seen as scientific. It had this sort of patina of having science behind it. And, you have to say she's by no means alone. I mean, there's Beatrice and Sidney Webb were eugenicists. Julian Huxley was a eugenicist. You mentioned George Bernard Shaw wrote for her magazine. That's not a surprise. He was a eugenicist. D.H. Lawrence was a eugenicist, and Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
It's quite a list.
Well, and, you can see up to a point the way in which you can align it with progressive politics before you understand the slippery slope that eugenics will take human history down in the Second World War. You can see the arguments that it will prevent suffering. And that's the argument that is sometimes associated with the positive eugenics as well, as how do we prevent suffering? And certainly that was how Woodhull saw her own argument developing. It seems very clear that her commitment to eugenics came out of her own experience from her first marriage of having a son who was born with severe developmental disabilities. He lived to be an adult. He lived for a long time. She always had to look after him. He was very, very limited.
Never lived an independent life.
No, he could never live an independent life at all. And she saw his suffering and his challenges as being the direct result of her having had a forcible sexual relationship with her first husband, who was a chronic alcoholic. She anticipated what medicine would later prove, which is fetal alcohol syndrome can create, severe developmental disabilities. And she believed that that was what happened to her son. She may well have been right. And so for her, this was a way of trying to prevent suffering. Contraception was seen as, it's on a spectrum with things that we would find totally acceptable, like family planning. Right? It's on a spectrum of trying to say we can have a rational approach to the way in which we want to build a family. We can make choices about what is safe and unsafe, about what is reasonable and unreasonable. The problem is eugenics. Well, there are lots of problems with eugenics, but one of them is that it goes so far so quickly.
And there is an overlap between family planning, moves and campaigns for women to have access to contraception, and eugenics. I mean, Margaret Sanger, who's in so many ways an admirable figure, was deeply committed to eugenics.
Well, so was Shaw, for that matter, right? They believed it would bring about a better version of human society, and as we're saying, that it would prevent suffering.
And it's one of those things that it's not left or right. It's not an ideology only of the right or only of the left.
No, people cut across.
Yeah, and that's why in some ways it is it's depressing that it's something that she turned to late in life, but it's not surprising that someone from a progressive liberal mindset could become a eugenicist, because a lot of people on the list of famous supporters are on the left. And in Britain, eugenics is a movement. It's a very vocal movement, but it actually never translates into laws. But it does in America.
It does in America. And forced sterilization was on the books in the United States until, in several states in the Deep South, until the 1970s. There are whole tranches of communities that were forcibly sterilized in the United States. And it will not surprise you, David, I'm sure you already know this, to know that a very high proportion of the people who were forcibly sterilized in the United States history were African American.
Yeah, I think it's 31 states passed eugenics laws in this period.
Yeah. One essay she published called for a lethal chamber to eliminate society's most burdensome people. And that should sound terrifyingly familiar.
It does. And that phrase, that idea of a lethal chamber, that was a phrase that was echoing around the eugenics world. D.H. Lawrence wrote an essay in which he called for, again, exactly the same term, a lethal chamber as big as the Crystal Palace, into which, again, people deemed to be unfit or unworthy would be killed. And that phrase, with all of its horrible echoes of what's going to happen in the 20th century, is coming out of the mouths of other eugenicists at this time. And she is really, that phrase, wrong side of history, is a lazy phrase, but she's saying some really bad things at a really bad time when some of these things are literally being done to people. People are being stripped of their reproductive capacity because of decisions being made, laws being passed because of these ideas that she is actively promoting. A woman who had campaigned for freedoms is stripping other people of those freedoms through her campaigning. It's really, really shocking.
It is. And as you say, you can't underestimate the consequences of it, because it's not as if these ideas go away and then come back in the 40s. These ideas build and build and build. These are exactly the ideas that are going to influence the Nazis. These are exactly the ideas that shape Aryan thinking, that shape all of it. Now, it is worth saying, as terrible as this is, and without making any moves toward exculpation, it's interesting, though, that Woodhull herself rarely mentioned race explicitly. It's not what comes into her writing. She focuses on ideas of mental and physical fitness. But she certainly accepted the idea that some groups were inherently superior, and that's the key problem.
And there were eugenicists in Britain who really weren't that focused on race. They were much more interested in issues of class. And of course, that idea of class and race, they're not as neat as they are today in terms of the separation. People used to talk about the criminal race.
Exactly.
And race doesn't quite mean then what it means now.
Also true. And, there were events that she supported that were, we would find unquestionably horrific. For example, we were talking about the forced sterilization laws in the U.S. Very near the end of her life, in 1927, she praised a Supreme Court ruling that upheld forced sterilization laws in the U.S., saying, she was basically boasted, saying, I've been advocating for these policies for 50 years. And she took pride in them upholding forced sterilization laws. She saw herself as a visionary, right? Always ahead of her time. But we see in that moment, as she looks back and sees her own ideas taking root, the ideas that took root were not in the feminism that she had championed. They were in the eugenics movement that would cast such a long, dark shadow, the one that we're talking about.
And it makes it so difficult to come to a view about her in the end. I mean, if she had died in 1877, if that chapter of her life in Britain hadn't happened, it would be really simple to say, here's a remarkable, radical, creative, dynamic, scandalous figure. But that final chapter and those terrible ideas of which she's not just a supporter, she's an active participant, they really complicate the picture. And I don't know what to think about her now. Well,
she died not long after boasting that she had been advocating for that Supreme Court decision in 1927. She was 88 years old. And by that point, she was kind of forgotten ghost in the history of American feminism. Of course, women had gotten the vote by that point as well. But yes, we are left then with this question of what do we make of her? It is, as we said at the beginning, a deeply contradictory legacy. This is a woman who defied Victorian norms and demanded freedom for women, and then endorsed policies that stripped freedoms from women and other groups, all in the name of progress. Well, what do we make of her?
I mean, it makes me think of a position I often find myself taking, which is that there are heroic actions, but the idea of the heroic individual is really problematic, because you can either ignore all the bad things. You can forget this final chapter and just focus on the nice things, in which case that's not really history. That's sort of cherry picking. Or we can celebrate the amazing, incredible, outrageous things that she did, and also at the same time acknowledge that she's part of something, a very, very dark chapter in the story of the 20th century. And I guess we got to do both.
A little bit both. And there's another resonance, too, that I think is worth picking up, which is that Victoria was one of the first casualties of the Comstock Law, which was the one that she was arrested under for obscenity in 1872. And then that led the way for the passage of what became called the Comstock Law in 1873. But she was not the last of the Comstock Law's casualties. We mentioned Margaret Sanger earlier. She was arrested under that law for distributing
contraception.
Information about contraception. The Comstock Laws restricted birth control for decades, and they are now, today, resurfacing in abortion battles because they allow for a legal case to be made that abortion pills cannot be sent by the mail, the same way that her weekly magazine telling about Beecher's adultery couldn't be sent by the mail. So an 1873 law written to control women is still being used for the same purpose today.
This has ended in a much more depressing place than it started.
Well,
I was enjoying the early Victoria, this kick-ass woman.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, she begins her career by demanding that women should be free, and she ends her career by saying that the state should decide for them. Her life is not a simple story. It's not a simple story of triumph. It's not a simple story of tragedy. So I don't have an answer to how we think of her. I think, as you say, we have to be able to see both sides of the story. That's what history demands of us. But that's what being a grown-up demands of us too. I mean, we're not childish. But it's also, to me, it's a reminder, it's about social revolutions, that revolutions are never finished. And that even, the most radical visionaries often, and we see it over and over again, they become the architects of new forms of power. And those forms of power can often spin beyond their control.
If you were making a movie of Victoria Woodhull's life, you'd be very tempted not to tell that last chapter. I mean, I've heard this talk that there might be a movie.
Oh, is that right? Oh, Cate Blanchett has to play her.
Yeah.
She would be fantastic. She'd be so good. They have to do it.
But I love a story. We want the simple story. We don't want the dark fourth act. We want the heroic third act. But that's the difference between story and history.
If they make the Hollywood version of it and it's only the third act, then you and I we'll be writing op-eds all over the place. Don't forget the eugenics. This is the important coda.
Well, we should form a newspaper and campaign against it and find a scandal that we can explode.
We'll get arrested for telling the story through the mail. It will all come full circle again.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Well, that is the extraordinary story of Victoria Woodhull. I hope everyone enjoyed it.
It is an astonishing story. It's everything you told me it would be. I really enjoyed that.
So did I. Thanks very much, and hope to see you all next time.
Thank you for listening. Remember, understanding the experiences of those who came before us can offer incredible insights into our own lives today. So take that first step with Find My Past and start uncovering your family's stories.
That's right, David. If you visit findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime, you can sign up for the free trial as well as claiming an amazing 30% off their most popular subscriptions. That's findmypast.co.uk/journeythroughtime. Free trial auto-renews after 7 days unless canceled. Terms and conditions apply.